The topic that we wanted to start with today is about cloud disaster recovery. It's a term that we hear disaster recovery talked about a lot, and then we hear cloud talked about a lot, and oftentimes the feeling is, well, you don't have to worry about disaster recovery if you're in the cloud, but that's clearly not true. So perhaps we could start by just give a definition of what is meant by cloud disaster recovery.
Yeah, so there's a couple different meanings behind that. At its most basic premise, most people think of it as a regional failover or high availability within a region, but it can mean other things too, right? It should mean other things, including how your backups are resilience against disaster, not just natural disasters, not just system loss, but personnel as well, right? What happens if somebody comes in and tries to destroy your digital footprint? That never used to be an issue on-prem. If you go back 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you'd have a company come pick up tapes in the filing cabinet. If I walked into the data center with a sledgehammer and took it to the tape, somebody would stop me, and even if they didn't, there was a safe, secure backup of the tape. If I log in from home and I have access to everything, I shouldn't, but if I do, I can just delete the digital footprint. I can delete the active servers. I can delete the backups. I can take everything out, right? So redundancy has to, and DR strategy has to account for how to protect your entire digital footprint.
So what are some of the things that would cause someone to investigate cloud disaster recovery?
One of the reasons they might explore that option is if they have an existing on-prem infrastructure and they want to move into cloud. So they might have an older data center, they might have older equipment on-prem. It might be fine, but they want to do either a hot DR with the application ready to go, or warm DR partially ready to go, or even just a backup with processes and procedures and automation scripts to be able to stand up quickly. They might want to have that ready to go in the cloud in case something fails on-prem. Likewise, they might have an existing footprint somewhere in cloud and want to be able to cut over quickly to another region in case of a major failure, right? So if they're on the East Coast and there's a major network disruption, ecological event, something of that nature, they need to get quickly to the West Coast. These are the more common failure modes. Other less common ones would be, for example, it happens, but if they want to actually cut between cloud providers, for example. So that might be a case if there's a competitive advantage, or if they're competing with some of the cloud vendors in certain spaces, they might want the ability to quickly cut between clouds, or for regulatory reasons as well, right? Maybe due to regional availability, they need more copies, but they can't exist in certain regions or certain countries. So they actually have to look at DR strategies between cloud providers to account for that.
So when we talk about disaster recovery like this and switching between different geos or whatever, how do you decide what kind of latency or what amount of time you need to be able to switch over? What are some of the things that you should think about there?
Yeah, so there's a couple factors. The most commonly referenced ones are RTO and RPO, so recovery time objective and recovery point objective. So the time objective has to do with, hey, I've decided to actually cut over. How fast does this take me? The recovery point objective is how stale your data is, right? So you've had a failure in a region. You cannot guarantee 100% consistency of all data at all times between regions without some really heavy lifting. So usually people will accept a certain amount of loss, either temporarily or long-term. It's a risk mitigation, right? So a certain amount of data, maybe 30 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, it depends on the case, might be out of date between regions in a DR scenario. These are the two more common or the most common ways of measuring it, but there's other factors as well. So there's the RTO time for how long it actually takes, but then there's other decisions as well, like, hey, if a financial decision, for example, what's the penalty on waiting an outage, right? If it's going to be back in 12 hours, you can be back in 4. You might just wait it out and take the penalty. So sometimes there's a trade-off with whatever your SLAs or SLOs are with your clients. And you have to factor that based on what your client base is willing to sustain as well.
So I think when this goes, it's driven very much not only what's really in the end is all about cost, right? Whether I want to have an active kind of thing where I've got two things that are running always as close to parallel as possible, or whether I'm willing to almost do the backup or the restart from a standing stop. So one side failed, now we spin up the other one. What are some of the things that people should be thinking about there?
Yeah, so the backup method is usually good if you can sustain a higher recovery point objective, right? That might be on the daily basis or hourly basis. You're not syncing data in real time, right? You're not running, for example, a SQL database on both ends. You're doing a full backup, maybe incrementals occasionally. So it's by nature going to have a higher recovery point objective in most scenarios, right? Something commonly referred to as a warm backup. This would be where you run your data layer usually without the application, unless the application has to handle data in a special way. This is the scenario where you would incur partial costs, but have a more real time. Not completely. There would usually be a lag sync, but you would actually have a more real time copy of your data. 5 minutes or so, right? Below 5 minutes is where you start to get into the active scenarios, and these tend to be very expensive and very custom. So the problem with active is they require a real participatory application. So the application needs to be designed and built in a way generally, or supported in the underlying stack, which is usually not the case, in a way that can actually support an active scenario because of the synchronicity of the data, right? So otherwise, you're going to get into all kinds of issues with split brain scenarios and such if there's ever a network split, which there inevitably will be. So to do active, it's definitely the most expensive, and not just because you're running 2 copies, because you usually have to rebuild the entire application to fundamentally support this at every data layer.
Now, when you have a disaster recovery secondary system, what kind of processes and procedures should you be considering or be worried about in terms of making them, keeping them synchronized? So if you make a change on your active system, how do you also know that you got that same change made in your backup system?
Yeah, so it depends on the way you've implemented it generally, but for the most part, you want to be running everything from automation, right? So no matter what you're doing, if you're making a production change, it should be from an automation or at least a firm tested procedure that you can reproduce and that has been run on a staging system, a PET system, et cetera. Some other preliminary systems before production. So it works, and then you should be frankly booting up those systems in the secondary and applying it, or have the automation in place, right? So there's a lot of different ways of doing this, though. Some people will synchronize them on a recurring basis. Some people will test them on a recurring basis as well. That's always a good practice, right? Actually doing the production cutover and back. That's the important one. Everyone forgets to cut back, right? You need a procedure for that as well. Yeah. But generally speaking, you actually just want to exercise the procedures in a real environment. Production as well. You can count it as a maintenance window, and you should, but you should occasionally be doing that exercise in production to make sure your procedures actually work, the patch is applied the same way. System and bit rot's a real thing, right? Just because you're even using automation doesn't mean that there was not drift in terms of the way those things applied, especially if you're pulling down patches and things like that. Sometimes something as simple as somebody referenced, instead of a specific version of code, they referenced something with a latest tag, right? And you applied on a Monday, there was a new release on the Tuesday, and you applied it on the DR system on the Wednesday. They're now out of sync, right? For small changes, that's usually okay, but over years of these compounding, it leads to issues.
So what are the biggest cost concerns that somebody should have when thinking about disaster recovery? What are the main cost drivers, and where should you spend money versus maybe not?
So the biggest cost factor, I would say, is not the cost of actually implementing this, but you should always think in terms of what the cost is if you don't implement it, right? So if you come and you're like, hey, if I lose a week of data, nobody's going to care in 3 days from now. Okay, great. You don't really need a very comprehensive backup and DR strategy, right? If it's like, if I lose an hour of data, my company goes under. Well, that's the cost that we're going to have to weigh against when we're designing that solution, right? As long as that solution is costing less than that potentially inevitable event, then it's worthwhile. So that's kind of how I weight the cost at a very basic level, is I figure out what the cost of failing at this is first. Then I work from there. But that said, the real cost, the biggest cost, is generally if you need an active, and then it goes down from there to backups. But as a general rule of thumb, the more of the system you need online in a DR scenario, the more copies you need, the longer you need it for, and the shorter that RPO is, the more it's going to cost.
So we've kind of jumped to the assumption here that you would want to be in a mode where you could switch to another instance or another geo right away. But there have to be lots of cases where it's really just a matter, as long as I have the backup of data, I can then get my system restored.
Mm-hmm.
Does that count as disaster recovery, or is there a different term for that?
I would qualify that as resiliency of the data. It is a form of disaster recovery. If it goes down, you're able to eventually recover those systems and processes and various data. But the usual term for this is resiliency when you're talking about longevity of the data and ability to keep the data whole.
Mm-hmm. So if I have a disaster recovery system and I'm transferring things over as often as necessary so that the backup system can take over, I assume that I need more backups than that, right? So would you also have other backups that are being run at the same time?
Yeah, so Yeah, so there's a couple factors that should be considered, certainly. One of these is number of copies in terms of longevity, right? So if you picture, if I have a system, for simplicity, let's say it's backed up daily, and I'm only keeping 3 copies of that system, and I go away for the long weekend, I have a small IT team, right? If that system was compromised, for example, I don't really have a good reference point because I can't go back to a guaranteed clean copy if it was compromised as soon as the long weekend began. So, number of backups in terms of historical comparison points is important for situations like this. The other one that's going to be important is just, frequency of backups. This one has to do with the RPO time, of course. The other one that's going to be important, more than the number of copies, though, is the number of untouchable copies. So going back to the very first example, right? If I have access to production, I might be able to read a copy to do a recovery, right? I might be able to write new copies in, but I shouldn't be able to modify, mutate, or delete at least a certain number of copies in some system somewhere to ensure that not necessarily me, but the persona that is me, my credentials, even with 2FA and all the other protections, right, are never able to go in and delete those backup copies. So that's a definite protection that we have to factor in to all of these, but especially if, or I shouldn't say especially, but even if it's just a simple local backup, hey, I've got a website, it's a WordPress install and people do a modification every Tuesday. Well, you still need a secure, comfortable copy of that I or whoever it is that administers your system, a privilege separation, right? It's usually referred to as an air gap, where people, if you have access to production, there's somebody else with access to backups, and they're not the same person.
So if you're doing backups from your cloud environment, is it enough to just back it up to another place within that same cloud vendor, or should you back it up to another cloud vendor, or bring it even to on-prem so that you have something that's under your control?
Yeah, so that's going to depend on the specific industry. So generally speaking, any of the hyperscales are going to be fairly safe, right? So you can, as long as you're paying your bills, and even then they give you a lot of warning, you can generally be sure that your data is pretty safe as long as you take the proper controls and processes and make enough copies between enough accounts, right? So it doesn't matter which one of the hyperscales you choose. That might not be true with some of the smaller providers. There's been incidents where people do lose things on certain ones, not all of them certainly, but the smaller ones are more susceptible to it just because they don't have as large of a user base. From an industry perspective, though, sometimes there's geopolitical tensions, right? So there is cases where if I'm in a certain industry that is not looked upon favorably, or for political reasons or for term reasons, I might want to copy outside of the hyperscale for my own protection, and I might choose to put that in a smaller third party. So a great example, right, would be a company that does business in the US and China. They might want to, they might run their production infrastructure on AWS, for example, but they keep a copy of their database on Tencent, right, just for security in case there's ever a political incident that cut off their access to the AWS copy. So yeah, there's certainly that could just as easily be on-prem as it could be Tencent, though. So there's definitely cases where you might want to do that, but it's very specific to the industry, specific to what you're doing, the company makeup, and where you do business.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different things around disaster recovery, but is there anything in particular that we haven't touched on that you think is worth noting?
I mean, there's definitely some particulars. We kind of alluded to them before with the political issues, right? So obviously, if you're in the healthcare space, if you're dealing with any certain government data, these are going to be very special cases where you'll have to take particular caution with that type of data, where you keep it, how many copies you have. For example, Quebec, Canada has a very specific regulation around where data can reside and be processed for certain types of insurance information, just because of the sensitivity of it. In particular, a lot of that data cannot leave Canada. So you have to be really careful that you're not using a service outside of Canada for that very particular slice of data. This is true of many companies and countries as well. Common one is genealogy data, right? So a lot of churches today and various other institutions are putting all their records online. Well, they have to be really careful sometimes that those records, they can be accessible sometimes from anywhere, but they're not allowed to store the original source of truth data outside of the country that they've sourced all these historical archives from, for all the historical marriage records and so on. So There's definitely some cases like that, but it tends to be really industry specific or use case specific, right?
All right. So Transition Technologies has a cloud and managed services practice that you're involved in. If somebody called you in and said, I'm thinking about setting up disaster recovery for my cloud systems, where would you start? What kind of questions would you ask right up front?
So I would usually ask them about the cost of failure. I would find out a bit about, there's SLAs and SLOs, but then there's what their clients will actually sustain, right? I want to find out what their clients will really sustain. I could have an SLA of 24 hours for recovery, for example, but if my clients are leaving for 2 hours of outage, that doesn't really help me, right? There's a difference between the contract and what people actually, what they really perceive to be what they want. So I would usually start with figuring out what their clients actually want, whether it's internal clients or external, whatever the case is, right? Could be even internal employees, right? So I would start there. I would figure out the cost of like I said, of failure, and I would compare that against what they have and what they need to get to a point in terms of recoverability, in terms of resiliency, to give them the protections that they need. The other thing I would do is I would try to find out who their hostilities are, right? Whether it's employees, whether it's external actors, who's the person or group that's motivated to delete this digital footprint, right? And sometimes that's just, random attacks. Sometimes it's targeted, but I want to know what that group is and how motivated they are and what their technical capabilities are, because this might influence a little bit of a risk assessment around how strong these protections need to be, right? In an ideal world, we would give everyone all the copies and take maximum precautions, but there's cost to all these. So it's a weighting, right? We have to figure out the risk first. So I would usually start with those types of questions, figure out, kind of get a feel for overall. It's a very, in some ways, the questions are subjective because the answers might vary between who you ask as well, right? If you ask somebody, for example, in sales versus somebody in IT versus, somebody on the executive staff, you're going to get different answers. So it also means we also should be asking, and usually do, the same questions to every group, just to make sure we actually know what the true answer is. Because everyone, like I said, they're going to give a different perspective based on where their responsibilities lie.
So human nature being what it is, you'll ask these questions, get an answer, make a recommendation, and people will immediately ask, well, how can we make it not so expensive? Where is the normal place to start trying to save a little bit of cost? Is it to extend the RTO and RPO times, or something else?
No, that's actually the biggest ones, apart from, active sites, right? If you're keeping unused compute resources online, that always has a considerable cost, right? Especially if they're not being used by anything. So that's one of the biggest ones for sure. The other one, the cost, tends to be transfer as well. If there's any way we can reduce that, so maybe instead of doing fulls, we do incrementals, or particular to the technology, right? Maybe instead of an incremental, we're able to ship over log files, for example, to replay those records. That's assuming the recovery time objective actually supports us being able to do that. But that's very technology specific, right? So that would apply to relational databases, for example, but it might not apply to other sources of data. So it's very specific for reducing that bandwidth footprint. You usually pay for outbound bandwidth when it comes to most cloud providers. The other one is obviously the storage footprint itself. So there's ways of deduplicating this. A good example, right? If it's not really confidential data, or if we can split up the confidential data between buckets, we can't easily dedupe encrypted data, for example, right? That's every copy of it's going to be a little unique based on the new spice of data that we've mixed in. So if it's not confidential data, if it's not really secure data, this isn't the best thing to do for anything confidential, but maybe it's a case where we can store copies of generic data in a non-encrypted form, right? And then everything else in a different bucket that's encrypted. And then we can do some dedupe on it. Or we pull it open and we do the dedupe before it's encrypted. That's another possibility in cases where we need to do both, right? It's really context dependent to the particular problem scope that we're dealing with, though.
Very good. Well, I've certainly learned a few things from this. It's clear that you know you have a lot of experience in this area. So thanks very much for answering these questions.
Thank you.